In the second of our October webinars, we focused upon sheltering in an emergency capacity, people experiencing homelessness. A lot of that conversation turned on reimagining the systems that we use right now, which tend to be densely congregated. Obviously, something that cannot persist in our COVID-19 environment. I'd like to now reintroduce you to our subject matter expert for that session, Daniel Malone. Daniel, welcome back. Thank you so much for returning to help us address questions we didn't get to on our webinar series. Would you please introduce yourself to our returning participants and observers?
Great, good to be with you. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Malone. I am Executive Director of DESC, which is a nonprofit homelessness service organization in Seattle.
And in constructing shelter for people experiencing homelessness who also have these co-occurring disorders, how do you manage that? How are your systems designed in order to, accommodate or address or otherwise make available shelter and housing for people who are struggling with addictions?
We end up trying this, very reality-based approach with people to acknowledge these things are happening in their lives and doing as much as we can to remove any barriers to engagement or to service for people as possible, making sure that people understand that we're not here to punish them. We're not here to turn them away from things that they need, basic safety and so forth. And but we need something from them in return, which is some just honest engagement and dialogue.
That's consistent with what many people call a harm reduction philosophy. And is that one of the ethos that you believe should be taken into consideration when trying to address this?
The term sometimes can be loaded. And so, we try to make sure people understand what we mean by that. And basically, it's just this pragmatic, reality-based orientation that says, we recognize people have these kinds of challenges in their lives, and we can't just wish those problems to go away. So instead, we're going to meet people where they are and engage with them, knowing that they've got those conditions and problems, and do our best to make sure that the worst outcomes from those problem behaviors aren't realized, death being the most severe possible outcome, but lots of other kinds of problems come from chronic addiction.
So this question was posed in different ways by 3 or 4 of our participants in the last series. And one kind of related aspect of that question was, have you found some clients who would ordinarily avail themselves of your support and systems, avoiding going into shelter because they fear that their substance abuse or addiction conditions will be prohibited? In other words, they'd rather take their chances on the street. Is that a phenomenon that you've observed?
It isn't always really possible for people just to say, well, okay, I've developed these habits, if you want to call them that, or elements of addictive behaviors over a very long period of time. But if I want a place to be indoors for the night, I have to give all that up. It's just really not realistic for a lot of people. Yeah. And so people will vote with their feet, as we say sometimes, and not even attempt to utilize certain kinds of services when they believe it's just not oriented toward their needs.
How do you think the mindset of people who are entering your shelters or ultimately maybe into permanent supportive housing, how's that change? How does your particular set of approaches and philosophies kind of redound to how people's kind of outlooks and vision on their lives transform?
You are getting at something that is a real phenomenon that people have the ability and do have adjustments in their approach to life, in the way they think about things, when they have some of the stressors they've been living with lifted. It is an opportunity to kind of decompress, de-stress, and that allows some folks to start thinking about, oh, okay, I don't need to be perseverating on, X, Y, or Z that I've been focused on. And I can start thinking about what would be next for me outside of this life that has been totally consuming me. Can reset itself a little bit when you take away some of that intense stress.
And that is one of the tenets of another kind of ethos, namely housing first, that, in order to address people's, disabilities or challenges, they have to be stable. They have to have a place, a roof over their head, and some assurance that it's not going to be kind of taken away in the next 15 minutes. That's a guiding thought for you as well, I imagine.
Housing first is absolutely rooted in the idea that people will be unable, essentially, to address very profound underlying conditions and problems they have if their lives are remaining in a chaotic state.
So Daniel, I'm going to read this next question because it's preceded by a statement from one of our participants in the last webinar. Understanding the impact that homelessness has on each individual jurisdictions comes with my background as a social worker. What is the best way at a government level to provide support to local jurisdictions in the face of an emergency, say prior to an emergency declaration? What do local jurisdictions need or want from, say, the state in order to effectively respond to the crisis of congregate sheltering? And this goes to the heart of what you talked about in the first webinar about the projects you're undertaking to de-densify shelters, to use hotel space, that sort of thing. So please comment on that observation and question.
It feels to me pretty significant that so many suburban jurisdictions now are talking very openly about the fact that they know they've got these issues and that they need to do something about them, and that something doesn't mean just shipping all those people to, say, downtown Seattle.
You talked last time about the project in a suburban city, Renton, where you have placed formally congregated shelter occupants and clients. What's the latest with that? What's the news from that experiment, which is maybe the way forward?
One of the things that I think we've experienced in this particular case is that the move from a congregate setting in downtown Seattle to a hotel setting in a suburban jurisdiction happened very quickly, with very little opportunity to plan ahead and engage people in suburban jurisdiction. And that caused a lot of consternation there. It happened quickly because of the pandemic and the need to get people into safer environments. And so I don't think that you would want to repeat that if you can avoid it.
Individuals, as we know, of all walks of life, congregate. They come together. And while your best efforts are to de-densify and create less congregation, even at this hotel facility, there is the likelihood that the clients are going to get together and maybe even potentially create risk factors that you're trying to avoid. Are there strategies to try and deal with that? How do you discourage that kind of very human behavior without lessening the dignity and the freedom of the people that you're addressing, that you're trying to prevent from doing that?
We've had a couple of flare-ups that have caused some concern in that way. And that's due to these kinds of things, perhaps, that you're mentioning, that, people are getting a little lax about some of the non-congregating edicts. And so it's been a challenge that we are trying to redouble our efforts on, and doing more education with people to make them aware that this is not the time to be lax. It's the time to, help us get through this winter as best we can.
What about undocumented immigrants and their families who are experiencing homelessness? Are there strictures? Are there impediments to providing that level of service given some of the kind of political realities that we're experiencing?
Most of the survival services that I'm familiar with, that my organization operates, and that operated by other entities, don't put up barriers related to immigration status. I mean, it's not even asked about, basically. People are the intent of these survival services, shelter, food programs, that kind of thing, is to help people survive and get by from day to day. And so there aren't strict eligibility requirements or proof of identification or things like that that are typically required in those. There may be some programs that are more rigid in that way, but I don't think most are.
The population that you serve has been statistically assessed to be older, that there are geriatric symptoms of a lot of your clients that are early onset, that becomes a special kind of population with special needs. Has that been your experience, and how are you trying to address the aging of people experiencing homelessness?
So you have a scenario where even people who aren't chronologically very old have the characteristics as though they're, sort of physiologically older. The average age of the people we serve at DESC is in the 50s. But so many people who experience chronic homelessness have premature mortality that the age of mortality is generally in the early 60s. And so we now have all kinds of folks who are going through what you expect people to go through health-wise in their last 10 years of life. It's just some of them aren't that old. And so it has produced any number of challenges for us in serving people, where people need more attention, more hands-on care, more access to medical services. And so we've tried to ramp up bringing more of those services to our facilities so people can more readily access them.
Has your thinking changed as we look at COVID 2021? And what do you think is the end game?
I think it would just be a real shame if we, get through the pandemic whenever it ends, just having suffered, and then we go back to the old way of doing things that is, just sort of another version of the suffering that we've been engaged in for a really long period of time, when something can come out of it. So the silver lining really is we've experienced and we've shown that there's just a much better way to do this, to care for people who are in precarious situations because they find themselves experiencing homelessness. And let's make sure that we utilize those better methods that we've identified here during the pandemic.
Well, on behalf of the center, Daniel, thank you for returning to answer some of the questions that we didn't get to. We certainly appreciate all the work you do. We applaud you and commend you for your service, and I'm sure we'll be seeing more of you in the future. Thank you, Daniel.
Very good. Thank you, Clark, so much, and thanks to the center.
Thank you again, Daniel. There were two comments that were presented by participants at the conclusion of Daniel's presentation in our October webinar, and I'd like to share them with you now because I think they set the stage for a lot of what we've been talking about and we'll continue to examine in our program today. Here's the first one. Quote, Daniel brings up a great point. We need to build habitual working relationships before, during, and after COVID-19. Second, quote, I totally agree with what Daniel just said. I operate shelter services and happen to have a disaster and emergency preparedness background. I would not have had the knowledge of what to do early without that background. Relationships are essential, end quote.